Here we are in another snowstorm going up to Utah. I wanted to get some mileage figures because this Jeep is relatively stock. Here comes the snowplows. Because this Jeep is relatively stock. And we ran into all this snow. I did calculate the first tank. It was just over 17 miles to the gallon. And that was the first tank when the adaptives were learning. Hopefully the weather will be better on the way back and we can get some better numbers. Cold weather will get you less gas mileage also. That engine thermally is not running at peak when you have temperatures at or below freezing. It used to be manufacturers, I don't know if they still do this, but when an engine's new, it looks at the mileage on the counter, and the more miles that are on it, the more it kind of opens it up. Because as the engine loosens up, you can run more spark, you can run more PE, and it's safer. So we notice after 5,000-10,000 miles, these engines loosen up and they get better economy and run better. Modern engines are built very tight. Back in my day, the high-performance engines with the forged pistons could run 5,000ths piston clearance. That's why the engine rattled when you started it up. Then when the engine thermally stabilized and the pistons grew, it would quiet down. Today they're running piston clearances in the tenths of thousands. That's pretty tight, and that's the reason they're running the lightweight oil, like 020. But the benefit of that is less friction. If you run a lighter weight oil, that's less friction you have to deal with. In the old days, we used to shield the crankshaft from the oil splash. They said that was good for 10 or 15 horsepower. I don't know how accurate that is. But modern engines with deep sump pans have so much technology, it's really hard to say. So the real point of this video is what engine's going to get the best gas mileage? And I don't think there really is one best answer for that. We have big engines trying to mimic small engines trying to mimic big engines, and diesels. And we're just going to exclude diesels here because that's kind of a whole different ballgame right now. But let's take a look at two popular engines. Let's say the 6.4 Hemi and the new Stellantis Hurricane engine. From all the research I've done and people I've talked to, the engines perform very similar. The Hurricane has about 500 horsepower, the Hemi in the high 4s. But from what I understand, the Hemi has better bottom end torque, more grunt right off the line. Remember, you got to spool those turbos up. So from about 2,000 RPM up to redline, the turbo power comes in, and then it probably outperforms the Hemi. But the Hemi probably outperforms the turbo on the bottom end. And that's not to mention sound and everything else that the Hemi has going for it. So 1 mile per gallon difference really isn't that dramatic in my opinion. So why would you go with a twin turbo exotic 4-valve engine to gain 1 mile per gallon? Well, I think you have to understand where manufacturers are coming from. The Hurricane engine does weigh about 100 pounds less than the Hemi. It has modern aluminum and plastic construction. Now, I'm not a big fan of some of the new construction techniques, like mounting the catalytic converter right outside the exhaust port of the head without having a manifold, because that converter can run thousands of degrees, and putting thousands of degrees of temperature into a head can cause issues. And you guys with your Penstars and your Death Tick probably know that. Well, they're doing the same thing with the turbos. Here they're bolting them right to the head. You can correct me if I'm not right about that. But they're trying to make it compact, and they're trying to make an engine that is not only economical with fuel, but economical to build. And this is a very complex engine. So as I understand, it costs more than the Hemi right now, like a couple of $1,000s more if you were to buy a Grand Cherokee than the Hemi costs. So there is a cost to all this technology. Now, one thing I'm kind of disagreeing with them on is what they do with the cylinders on the Hurricane engine. Traditionally, aluminum blocks run a sleeve, a steel or an iron sleeve that the piston runs on for longevity and wear and everything else. The Germans are experts at a lot of things, and one of the things that they did is they go with this plasma spray or Nicosil spray or whatever it is they do. I remember way back in the 70s or 80s, I was looking at some Porsche cylinders and how they made them, and they had like this wire of nickel or some alloy, and they'd have it suspended in the middle of the cylinder, and then they'd put current through it, it'd blow up, and it would spray the nickel onto the cylinder walls, the aluminum cylinder walls. Now, welding steel to aluminum is nothing new. I used to work with a really expert welder that worked for the Navy, and that's how they put deck plates on aircraft carriers, explosion welding. So there's a lot of exotic techniques that are going into this engine. I know the Porsche cylinders and some of the other German cylinders last lasted almost forever. I've seen 911 cylinders with 200,000-300,000 miles, and they looked almost like new. But there's also been some big failures. Chevrolet tried that with the Vega, and it was a complete disaster, running the piston directly in the aluminum block without sleeves. Because the American consumer and the American roads can be a little bit different than the rest of the world. In a lot of countries, like if you go to Japan or you go to an island, you're not going 80, 90 miles an hour for hours on end. That's a high duty cycle on your engine. If you floored it for just a matter of 30 seconds, you're going 100 plus miles an hour, you gotta let off. Now Chrysler or Stellantis or whoever it is right now, the French, the Italians, are saying that they're saving, I forgot how many pounds, but it's many pounds of weight by not going to the steel sleeves, and they're probably saving some money too. Because remember, this is a dual overhead cam, 4-valve, twin turbocharged, very high stressed 3-liter engine. And what it's going to come down to is the longevity of this engine when it's under stress. Towing a trailer up a long grade on a hot day when the turbos are at boost. And these engines are going to run more than 20 pounds of boost, and that's very impressive. Back in our day, we would run 8, 10, maybe 12 pounds of boost, and that was considered risky. So let's get back to the comparison. Here we have a 6.4 Hemi, very low stressed, putting out near 500 horsepower, a lot of torque off the line, really good sound. Then you have a 4-valve, 3-liter twin turbo engine that puts out basically the same horsepower, maybe a little bit more. Now I will say this, with a turbo you can dial up any horsepower you want, and I'm sure there's going to be guys out there dialing them up to 600-700 horsepower plus, just like they're dialing up the 4-cylinder turbo right now. But 700 horsepower in a 3-liter engine means Chrysler really has to do their homework on the foundation of that engine, the crank, the rods. I think the high performance version of the Hurricane has a forged crank, but the lower performance one does not. So what it's going to come down to is keeping that engine together. Now you say, why would you want a 3-liter engine over a 6.4-liter engine? It's more than double the size. And how come the economy can be within 1 mile per gallon of each other? We got to go back to the philosophy that small engines are trying to act like big engines, and big engines are trying to act like small engines. The small engine has economies for several reasons. If you look at the European engines throughout the years, they've traditionally been small. 1 liter, 1.2 liter, 1.8 liter, 2 liters. 2 liters used to be considered a big engine in Europe. So first, let's say you have a 4-cylinder engine. You only got 4 pistons going up and down. The crankshaft doesn't have a whole lot of drag because basically it's running on a film of oil and there's very little friction there. But those pistons going up and down and those oil rings scraping the cylinders are definitely drawing some drag. But here's where you're gaining a lot of economy with a small displacement engine. Pumping losses. What are pumping losses? At wide open throttle, if an engine's at 100% efficiency, there are no pumping losses. But unfortunately, these engines are throttled most of the time. So if you're idling or just cruising around at low speed, the engine has to fight the vacuum built up in these cylinders, which is pretty strong. You try taking a piston, sealing off the head, and pulling that piston down, and you'll see how much resistance you get. So the small displacement engines don't have the pumping losses of the larger displacement engines, because we can generally say if you have a 6-liter engine and a 3-liter engine, the 3-liter engine is probably going to have half the pumping losses of the 6-liter engine. So what the big engines did is they said, okay, let's try to reduce the pumping losses and act more like the small displacement engine. So they have multiple displacement technology. Now you can have MDS, multiple displacement system from Chrysler, or AFM, active fuel management, or DOD, displacement on demand. It's all the same thing. And now GM has that new DFM, so you can run your V8 engine as a 2-cylinder. Now you don't get 100% of the energy back because essentially what they're doing is turning that cylinder into an air spring. So when you close the valves and you build up a vacuum, you gain that back by the negative pressure, which pushes the piston back. So you're gaining, I don't know the actual number, I've never seen a specification, but I'd say you're probably gaining 90% back. But there's some other losses with the big displacement engine. If you have a V8 engine, you got 8 pistons going up and down, 8 oil rings scraping the cylinder wall, and that's also friction. Where, let's say, a 4-cylinder or a 6-cylinder engine does not have that friction. And remember, friction is heat, so it's going to take more cooling to cool that V8 engine. However, the flip side is if you take a small engine and you want to try to get the horsepower that you're getting in the large engine, then you got to do something to get that power. Now you can build an extremely radical 4 or 6-cylinder engine with a really aggressive cam and 4 valves and all that stuff, And that was pretty popular with like the Japanese drifter cars and all that, building 300 plus horsepower. So what's the solution? Boost it, just like I did 50 years ago in aircraft. So now you put a turbocharger or a supercharger on your little teeny engine. 1 bar is 1 atmosphere. So if you put 1 bar into your engine, your little 3-liter engine, it's going to act like a much larger engine because you're forcing air into the engine along with fuel to make it act like it's a larger displacement engine. That's also going to build up heat. So now you're losing some of the gains of the smaller engine with forced induction, because when you compress air, it gets the molecules moving around and they collide with each other and they build up heat. That's why you need to run an intercooler, aftercooler, heat exchanger, water to air, whatever you want to call it. You got to get that intake air out, because you don't want to be forcing hot air into a hot combustion chamber, because that'll produce knock. And knock really was the limiting factor of power output, and it pretty much still is. How do you combat knock? Well, you get a cooler air charge and you run a higher octane fuel. And that's really what the performance came down to in World War II, was the higher octane fuels, which allowed higher manifold pressures. So the smaller engines with high octane fuel were running more manifold pressure and outperforming the bigger engines with low octane fuel. And that's exactly what's happening in the evolution of these American engines. Now remember, the Europeans have been doing this a long time, and from what I understand, Chrysler took a really hard look at the BMW M engine, the 6-cylinder. I don't know if it was the M4, M6, one of them has a 6-cylinder engine with virtually identical specs to this new Hurricane engine. And I'm pretty sure that's what Chrysler and Stellantis is trying to emulate. So this technology has been around for a while, and how it's implemented is going to be important. But back to the basics. The Hemi is a low-stressed engine. It's normally aspirated. It's not forced induction. One of the benefits of a large displacement, normally aspirated engine is that it is so low-stressed, it can run at lower RPM and put out more torque. Now that's not so important in a little 2,000-pound grocery getter, but if you have a 6, 7, 8,000-pound Jeep, especially if you're towing a trailer, that low-end grunt and extra displacement can really be a benefit. Now, one of the benefits of the turbocharged engine is altitude isn't as important. Normally aspirated engines start dropping horsepower off about 3% per 1,000 feet. So at 10,000 feet, you're losing 30% of your horsepower. Well, with a turbocharged or supercharged engine, you can get that power back by cramming more air into it. So again, it's just another give and take. What's my opinion? Well, my opinion would be, if I had a work truck that I was going to go out and I was going to tow a trailer with it, and I was going to have it under a high duty cycle, meaning if I had the turbocharged engine, I'd be in boost all the time, I just get the bigger engine, because I feel the longevity and the drivability would be better than the smaller displacement forced induction engine. Now, if I did have a little Chevy Sprint with a 3-cylinder 1-liter engine and I wanted to merge onto the highway, then I think a little turbocharged engine would be great. Get really good economy. It's a small, compact engine, suffers from very little pumping losses and friction. Now, there's no doubt that the smaller displacement engines that are boosted or have forced induction have the capability of putting out a lot of horsepower. And I'm sure Chrysler's going to capitalize on that. But what we have to look at is longevity, drivability, and all the other concerns. It does not have the torque or the grunt or the sound of the Hemi at the bottom. Once you get into the mid and top range, then it's a horse race. Now, one final consideration with a small displacement boosted engine is power delivery. It's not exactly linear. With a normally aspirated engine, power delivery is pretty much 1-to-1 with the throttle position. So you open the throttle 20%, you get 20% more power. Or at least there is no rubber band effect. You can very precisely control the power output of the engine with the throttle valve. With a turbocharged engine, because you're going to be running more than atmospheric pressure into the engine, that turbo has to spool up. And when the turbo spools up and it gets on the pipe, that power kind of comes in a non-progressive or non-linear fashion. So let's say you start getting on to pass somebody, that turbo spools up and you start accelerating hard. Then you say, oh, I got to abort. I see a car coming the other way, and you let off. Well, that boost is built up, and it's still going to keep charging on even when you let the throttle up. So that's going to be another negative of the small displacement boosted engine, is while you can get that top end and mid-range power, it's not going to be quite as usable or precise. Now, driving a turbo, I used to have a 930 Porsche, and it was the same way. except the older turbos weren't really electronically controlled, so the turbo lag was really bad. If you got in a race with somebody, you would floor it. And I remember doing this because I had a lot of muscle cars and I had a 930 Porsche, and that Porsche was really quick. But if somebody came up next to you and floored it, and you floored it, you'd have to wait about a second or two before that turbo came on the pipe, and that guy would be a car or two ahead of you, and then you had to catch up. Now, in most cases, I probably did because that turbo had a lot of power. But the larger displacement engine isn't going to suffer from that deficiency. It's going to be completely linear. When you floor it, you're going to go. Now let's switch over to the LT, because the LT kind of also is a different animal. What the LT did was what the Hemi didn't, and that is it evolved to not only mimic the smaller displacement engines, but to enhance power. So the LT went to higher compression. Going to higher compression is somewhat akin to boosting an engine, because that is your potential energy, is how much cylinder pressure you can build up. By going to the 11.5 to 1, like the engine I'm driving right now, what it comes down to is how do you control that and spark knot? Well, GM added continuous variable valve timing. That gives you one measure of controlling cylinder pressure. They went to direct injection, which, by the way, the new Hurricane engine is also direct injection and more efficient. GM knew about the friction losses in the larger displacement engine having more parts, so they made everything as low friction as they can, even the external components like the alternators and such. Low friction bearings, low viscosity oils and fluids. The new 10-speed runs the low viscosity transmission fluid. You still have 8 pistons, but you've reduced that internal friction and drag to the minimum that you possibly can. Then GM really went nuts on the cylinder deactivation. Now, back in the 80s, Cadillac had a 468. I don't know if you guys remember it, but it was really ahead of its time, and it was implemented too early. They didn't have the electronics we have today, so when it would switch between the 468 mode, the throttle position would change. Because remember, when you go from an 8 to a 4-cylinder, the output of the engine's going to drop dramatically. So that means the throttle body has to make up for that. And that's all done electronically today, where it couldn't be done back then. They did have solenoids in the engine that would deactivate the cylinders just like they do today. But with today's electronics being so fast and so quick, and high-speed knock sensors, and that's really important, because when you go to a 4-cylinder mode, or even 3 or 2, the load's going to increase on those cylinders, and they're going to have more likelihood of knocking. So having ultra-fast knock sensors mean they can better control knock. Remember, the modern V8 engine is almost like 8 separate cylinders. Each cylinder has its own spark control and fuel control. GM really went the next step with dynamic fuel management. Dynamic fuel management means you can run on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or even at 8 cylinders to reduce pumping losses as much as possible. So what does this mean? Well, this means that, at least at this point in my opinion, the LT engine can be more efficient than the Hemi. And I can tell you, we drove our Denali 2017 L86 Denali 6,000 miles across country and back, fully loaded down. I don't know what the weight was, but it was probably pushing over 7,000 pounds. And we averaged just shy of 23 miles to the gallon. And we weren't going 60 miles an hour most of the time. So let's say the LT does get 1 or 2 miles to the gallon better than the Hemi. Well, now we're right back there with the same efficiency as a 3-liter, high-stressed, 20-something pound boost engine. One thing you can do with a 3-liter engine that you can't do with the LT is you can simply tune it and get as much power as you want. With a normally aspirated engine, you usually have to make some kind of modification. Now, of course, you could put on an LT4, LT5 blower, whatever, and get all the horsepower in the world. We have an LT5 on the road now in a Wrangler JK, and that thing is just like driving an LT1. You don't even know there's a blower on it. It doesn't even make any noise. But you can imagine how much torque and power a 6.2-liter boosted engine puts out, let alone a 3. So what this comes down to is the LT ahead of the curve when it comes to this V8 technology. The LT is an all-aluminum construction, so the weight is similar to the Hurricane. The Hurricane's just over 400 pounds, the Hemi's over 500 pounds, and the LT is just over 400 pounds. So the LT is right in there with economy and weight and efficiency. Both engines have the ability to be modded, power adders applied, and get whatever level of performance you want. I would say, though, that the turbo is going to have an advantage in that arena, unless you consider emissions. Because remember, everything we try to do is emissions related. So what you're going to end up having is a very high-stressed, small displacement engine that's going to be very similar in economy and power to a very low-stress, large displacement engine. I do feel that the large displacement, low-stressed V8 is going to have better durability, longevity, and drivability with that low-end grunt but I think the high-tech, small, highly boosted, high-stressed engine is going to be very similar in performance, be easily opened up for more performance, and what it's going to come down to is, what is the longevity of that motor going to be? What is the drivability of that motor going to be? It's probably going to be good in my opinion because it's an OE manufacturer. What I mean by that is if you look at the Penstars and the 3.8 Super and turbochargers out there, and this is not to bang those guys, but they never had the drivability of a factory turbocharged or boosted engine. If you drive a Maserati bi-turbo or one of the other Chrysler products, Hellcat, whatever, they put a lot of time into those operating systems. Same thing with the LTs. The LT5 is pretty amazing. The LT4 is amazing. But these are operating systems that were designed for 2 and 3 bar boost. Really at this point, I think the traditionalists like me are always going to go for the V8. We're always going to go for that sound, that low end torque, the low RPM, low stressed cruising on the highway. And I do a lot of cruising, guys. You know, driving 80 miles an hour up and down these hills in snowstorms and in 110-degree weather can be very stressful on an engine. And I know when I drive the smaller engines that are always screaming and upshifting and downshifting, it just doesn't make me feel as comfortable as a large displacement engine putting along at low RPM. But that is what's going on right now, and the question is, these are stopgap engines. The internal combustion engine, or ICE engines, if some had their way, would be going the way of the dodo, meaning they would go extinct. But I think that those environmentalists are finally realizing that it's not as easy as they think. Hauling coal to drive plants and natural gas production to support electric cars is a problem all on its own. And there's a host of other issues with electric cars when it comes to long distance. If I was to drive 6,000 miles across the country, there's no way I would drive an electric vehicle. We would have to plan the route around charging stations, and we'd have to have long stops to charge our car, and we're just not going to do that. We literally drove straight from Las Vegas to Orlando non-stop, switching drivers, and you're just not going to do that with an electric car. 2030, 2035, I think is a little bit ambitious, and I think that guys are starting to realize that. So what's happening is the ICE engines have to get more efficient, and I think Chrysler, or maybe the Europeans that own Chrysler, thought we got to do something about this really wasteful V8 engine. But at the end of the day, it really isn't, because when you look at the actual economy gains, it's not that much. Now they say the emissions are less, it's a higher tier, and that may be true, but it's not dramatic. You're not picking up 20% economy on this engine. So there's going to be these stopgap engines that are going to transition us from what we have now to what we're going to have, and that's probably going to be hydrogen, electric, some combination of the two. What Toyota is doing right now with basically an ICE engine and powering it off hydrogen is mimicking what internal combustion engines do now, rather than use an electric motor, and I really like that. The problem with hydrogen is obviously the storage of it and the sophistication of the containers and electronics to make it safe. But driving that car is very similar to driving a gas vehicle, and filling it up I think only takes a minute or two. You don't have to sit there for hours charging it. So I think that direction has a lot of promise. So I think what Chrysler has done is they're putting a high technology small engine in the place of what they perceive to be the large displacement, wasteful, heavy gas guzzler. Now, are guys going to go for it? I can tell you that most everybody I know would buy a new Hemi Wrangler over a Hurricane engine if they have that choice. I do understand that the Hurricane's going to cost more money, at least for the meantime, and they may even keep the 6.4 Hemi on the books for a little while for the heavy-duty applications and trucks that tow and are under a high load. So me growing up in the old days, I'm going to stick with the V8 as long as I can, and I think as long as GM stays on the ball and keeps improving the V8 to match the performance of these other replacement engines or substitute engines, then they're going to remain really popular. If I have the time, I'm going to try to document the economy on this engine on the way back. This is really one of the first relatively stock Jeeps I've driven in a long time. Most everything I'm driving is on 40s. If you watch the video for the last Jeep I drove, it was a monster. So getting in something like this is kind of a treat, and we can actually get some real-time numbers. Now, we do have some real-time numbers in the other monster Jeeps, but in something that's pretty much stock, I want to compare the V8 to the smaller engines, and I can say I almost sold my Jeep because driving on the same highway trying to hold 80 miles an hour was such misery, and my wife didn't feel safe in it, that yeah, we almost sold our Jeep. With the V8 it's completely the opposite. Looks like I'm in my living room right now, even going through a snowstorm. Here we are in another snowstorm up in Utah. The entire life of this vehicle with its new engine has been in snowstorms, all the way up to Utah from Vegas and back. So we wanted to check some miles per gallon numbers, and we got just about 17 on the first tank. This tank we seem to be doing a little bit better. The speeds have dropped a little because the road conditions. We're cruising at about 70, and we've gone about 130 miles on the first quarter of a tank, so that's promising. I think we're going to get 300 miles to this tank easily. The battery light is on, and I'm going to explain that. On the earlier JKs, there's something called a desired charge goal and an actual charge. The desired is what the ECU sets as this is where we want to be, and then actual has to follow it. If they don't follow, your battery light comes on. In the older JKs, the PCM had that duty. I do believe the TIPM is actually what sets the charge goal, but the PCM controls the fields on the alternator. And that's been true on the Chryslers all the way back to the SMECs in the 1980s, single module engine controllers. In the late model JKs, the TIPM also reports codes, and that's why this battery light is on. Motec has chosen to use the GM alternator on the LT builds because the GM system is a little more sophisticated. It has a very powerful alternator that is low friction, and in the OE production vehicle, the GM system can sense amperage and battery health and all sorts of other things. It might drop below 12 volts and it might go over 15 volts. In the early day of the LTs, a lot of the customers in their Suburbans and whatnot saw that gauge go to 12 and go to 15, and they thought they had a problem, but they really didn't. GM didn't dumb down the gauge like Chrysler has, like on the coolant temp. So that was just something they had to deal with. Anyway, we're going to continue through this storm. Looks like the windshield is trying to grow a tree. Of course, our MOCAN module or our CAN bridge will handle that. It just needs to be set to the right settings, and then that light will go out. Several years ago, I was talking to some Jeep engineers in Troy, Michigan, and they were telling me that aerodynamically, the Jeep JK turns into a brick at about 65 miles an hour. Up to 65 miles an hour, the bad aerodynamics can kind of be tolerated, but for every 5 miles an hour you go over 65 miles an hour, the loss of economy is geometric, just because the drag builds up so much. Now, in my opinion, a turbocharged engine, like the little 4-cylinder turbo, would probably do really well under these conditions. It's cold out, we're at high altitude, and that little turbo is probably going to be in boost quite a bit, but that's where those engines really like to run. This normally aspirated LT, if we're going to get 300 plus miles out of a tank in a snowstorm, I think that's pretty good too. Well, after a couple of hundred miles of snowstorm, it seems to have let up a little, and it's still cold out. We just turned over 200 miles, and we still have over half a tank. So that's promising. All right, guys, we've gone 300 miles, or close enough. We still have over a quarter of a tank. We actually have close to a third of a tank, but we have to go through the Virgin Gorge and into Nevada, and that's about 30-40 miles. So we're just going to go ahead and stop here and get some gas. We went from just outside of Park City, you guys can Google it, Heber City, to St. George on one tank. I'm going to guess we're about 18 plus miles to the gallon. Now, consider that this is a close to 500 horsepower V8, and we don't have active fuel management active. If active fuel management was active, I think we could be pushing close to 20 miles to the gallon. Now, a 2-liter 4-cylinder might beat that, but if you consider you're driving a low stress, in fact, most of the time I was running at or under 2,000 RPM on this trip, and we did go through 2 snowstorms. So I think you can say that to have a low stressed 500 horsepower V8 getting close to 20 miles to the gallon is nothing to sneeze at. Well, this is what 300 miles of going through snowstorms looks like. Most of the snow actually melted off. We took 13.8 gallons of gas for over 300 miles, or actually for just under 300 miles, 298 miles. So just in my head, that's going to be over 20 miles to the gallon, and that's pretty good. In the 60s, that would have been cool. In the 70s, that would have been far out. In the 80s, that would have been bitchin'. In the 90s, that would have been bad. In the 2000s, that would have been good. Anyway, you look at it today, considering we have a 500 horsepower vehicle, that's doing really good. So let's go in and do the math. All right, guys, so we went 292.9 miles. And we're going to divide that by 13.88. 21.1 miles per gallon. Wow. That actually surprises me, considering this is only the third tank of gas on this vehicle, and pretty much most of the drive was through a snowstorm. But I think the key was the lower speed. We were running between 65 and 70 most of the way. We are cruising along here in Red Rock in this late model JK with an LT 110 speed. We took this Jeep up to Utah, and I did a lot of yakking on that, and I don't even remember what I talked about, so I'm just going to wrap this up. This Jeep got over 20 miles to the gallon. I think I got over 21 miles to the gallon, and that's a 6.2 LT. Not sure if it's an LT L86 or LT1, but guys say, well, is there a lot of advantage to running the LT the way it's supposed to run? Because a lot of guys are switching it back to port injection. They might think it's more reliable, simpler, whatever. And the reality is, if you do that, you just have an LS. So yeah, I really do think it's worth running the LT with the direct injection and the continuous variable valve timing, and of course the 10-speed transmission. So to wrap up this video, I wanted to say, when we got this Jeep, the coil springs were sacked out. It doesn't even have a lot of options on it, but the Sports and the X's, especially in the early days, had really wimpy springs for a better ride. I had a 2008 X, and before we even put the V8 in, it was sacked out in the front, sitting on the bump stops, and so was this one. So we did change the springs out. I do believe we went with 2.5 inch metal cloak game changer springs, or variable rate, but there's a lot of other springs out there, and springs are pretty important. We've had some really top heavy Jeeps that we put wide axles on, like the 72-inch Dynatracs, to keep them more stable and roll. And we found that just using stock off-the-shelf springs can cause a PIO, I used to call it, pilot-induced oscillation, where as the vehicle rolls, it tends to steer one way or the other, so you're just chasing the wheel going down the road. And we swapped the springs out with springs that were designed for heavy vehicles. In fact, in one case, we actually had to use springs out of an ambulance. And AEV makes some heavy-duty springs, which we find work really well, and they do help those vehicles steer better. So this vehicle now has new game changer springs, and I'm sure they're going to settle out. Guys ask me if you got to change the springs on their build, and in general, no. If you're running a all aluminum LS or LT, you're not really adding that much weight to the vehicle, and a lot of that weight's in the middle. If you put a 200-pound steel bumper up front with a 100-pound winch, you're adding 300 pounds in front of the axle. If you got a Hemi, you're adding a lot of weight in front of the axle. But with the LS, you're really not. So if you have a stock Jeep and it already has the bumper and the winch and the armor and all that, then the odds are you might have to either run a budget boost, one of those little pucks, or change the springs out, maybe add an inch to whatever you got right now. We're going to go to the mountain. We'll see you soon.